Hi everyone, Mrs. Thorson again. Today we are going to be finishing up Unit 2. We're going to be talking about the the different types of civil rights that have been provided for Americans throughout American history. So it's a little bit of a history lesson today. So civil rights are basically, this is a fancy way of saying it, policies designed to protect people against arbitrary or discriminatory treatment by the government officials or individuals. So basically, what is that saying? It's when the government makes some type of rule or policy that protects groups from a discrimination that they had experienced in the past. The three types we're going to look at today, we're going to look at racial discrimination, gender discrimination, and then the other category because other factors have been introduced as of recent. But race and gender discrimination have been occurring for centuries. So let's talk about race but first. So slavery, with slavery, where they started, they had zero rights. The Dred Scott versus Sanford case said slaves were considered chattel or property, so they weren't even allowed rights as citizens, which is about as low as it gets. And with that, slavery could be anywhere. Well, the Civil War ended slavery, was a fight for the end of slavery. It did end with the 13th Amendment. And with the 13th Amendment, we no longer have slavery. So the 13th Amendment is an example of a civil right that was given to take care of the discriminatory act of slavery that was against a group, in this case, African Americans. Now, even though slavery no longer existed, the South still tried to create laws that segregated and treated Black Americans as inferior. And this would be known as Jim Crow laws or Black codes or segregation laws. All of them are the same thing. And it came to a point with Plessy versus Ferguson where a man, Plessy, who was 1/8 Black, was on a white train car and he got in trouble for it. And he basically said, well, I'm mostly white, so I should be able to be here. And they said, well, no, you're a little Black, so you're all Black in the eyes of the law in the South. So he took it to the court and he said these separate Black and white accommodations are bad and facilities are bad. And the court said, no, it's okay. As long as it's equal, separate facilities are okay. So this just reinforced the Jim Crow laws in the South for another 60 years. Well, with the era of civil rights, we see this in the 1950s starting. The first major turning point was the Brown versus Board decision, where they basically said separate but equal is not constitutional. Separate facilities for Blacks and whites in the South, specifically school, is unconstitutional. So you need to integrate school, as they said, with all deliberate speed. But the South's like, yeah, we're not doing that. So it took a while before the Southern white governments actually put that into play. Another thing they tried with schooling is to bus students of different races to different schools because when it comes to segregation, there's two types. There's de jure and de facto. De jure segregation is by law. That's Jim Crow laws. But de facto segregation is what happens in reality. Typically, you see people of certain races living in certain neighborhoods. So there's, and when that happens, those are the types of schools you go to. And typically at the time, Black Americans were living together in neighborhoods that had poorer schools than white Americans. So to take care of that inequality, another civil rights piece of legislation passed, which was known as school busing, where they would take a group of Black kids and a group of white kids and switch them to go to different schools so that Black kids could have a better chance of a good education. But what really got schools to get integrated wasn't the Brown versus Board decision. It was actually the Civil Rights Act in 1964, passed by Lyndon B. Johnson, that said not only is public discrimination or is discrimination in schools not allowed, but it's not allowed anywhere. You can't have it at any hotels, restaurants, public accommodations, anything. And the Equal Opportunity Employment Opportunity Commission would be the enforcer of the Civil Rights Act of 64. And it was very successful. If you look at this chart, you can see that this is showing you the percent of black students attending white schools with any white people in the southern states. And you could see the Brown decision was 1954 and nothing happened. And then you start in the Civil Rights Act, they're finally like, okay, I guess we have to do this. And they started integrating schools. we're also looking at their right to vote. So another civil right is the right to vote. That's also known as suffrage. African Americans got this with the 15th Amendment. And ways that white governments in the South tried to get around this to prevent Black people from voting was with poll taxes, where they said, well, you can vote, but you have to pay for it. And they knew that a lot of the Black citizens in the South were poor, so they figured that would be a way to get them to stop voting. They also tried to make it so that only white people could vote in the primaries, so they were the ones that could pick the one candidate from each party to run in the general election. The courts found both of those. Well, the court found white primaries unconstitutional, but then there was an amendment to the Constitution that poll taxes are no longer allowed. So these were pretty bad things that the white people in the South tried to do with Jim Crow laws to prevent Black people from their legal right to vote. But then eventually either court decisions or amendments said, quit it, you're being jerks. They have the right to vote. All right, let's look at women. So women during this time, let's get rid of this. Oh, it just disappears on its own. Hang on. Sorry about that. So women at the time of like the 1840s, they were fighting for things like temperance and abolition, and then eventually started fighting for women's rights. And one of the biggest ones they pushed for a very long time was the right to vote. And they finally got it in 1920. With the 19th Amendment. But then from the 1920s to 1960s, the era known as the doldrums, it kind of was a time when we saw women's rights kind of go by the wayside and we stopped focusing on it. So next came the second feminist wave. The first one was in the early 1920s or 1900s through 1920. The second one was in the late 1960s, early 70s, where they fought for women's rights. We saw some court cases get decided in favor of women's rights. They said that any type of gender discrimination violates the 14th Amendment. But then in 76 with the Craig versus Boren case, they basically said, well, it can be allowed if there's some type of what they call medium scrutiny. And they try to be very vague with this so that it can be interpreted in many different ways. But that's a situation where like it's okay to gender discriminate if it's like, for instance, let's say every male PE teacher at the high school quit. It's okay to say we're only going to hire a male PE teacher. That would be the medium scrutiny because they need someone male to supervise the locker room. So that's an example where they're saying like it's medium scrutiny, it's okay. They tried to pass that Equal Rights Amendment that they tried in 1923. They tried it again, but it failed and it is not part of the Constitution, which basically would have said gender cannot be in any type of law in any way, shape, or form, including the draft. So like, for instance, if this passed, women would have to sign up for the draft at 18 as well. Women in the workplace, the 1964 Civil Rights Act banned any gender discrimination. The Equal Pay Act banned any discrimination in getting paid differently from a man for the same job. Though there's a law about it, but there hasn't really been any issues at the Supreme Court with it. Women in the military, only men can be drafted, but now women can fight in combat. And sexual harassment is illegal because of also the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act covered a lot of stuff. That was probably one of the greatest pieces of American legislation ever. So other groups are fighting for civil rights, not just women and people of color. We're also seeing this with old people. So the civil rights that are getting pushed right now is to end ageism, where people feel they are getting discriminated against because they are older. But there's not like a suspect category with that, but they have to fall under the rational basis test. So like, for instance, when I say that you can't discriminate based on someone based on age, but there's also, you got to be rational with it. So like if I own a moving company and I need someone to move heavy furniture, I can, under the rational basis test, refuse to hire an 80-year-old person who is weak versus like a 20-some-year-old man. So that's an example where it's okay. The civil rights that were fought for with people with disabilities, that was a big success in the 90s when they passed the American with Disabilities Act, where they basically said any employment area cannot discriminate against people with disabilities, and there needs to be public accommodation provided for people with disabilities. So this is when we start seeing wheelchair ramps at schools and in public restrooms and the handicap parking spots, that kind of stuff. Another group that fought for and is continuing to fight for civil rights are the LGBTQ community. We saw this in the 80s where in 1986, Bowers versus Hardwick said the right to privacy for gay couples does not exist. And then it was overturned not too much later in 2003 because they have the right to privacy. It's protected by the Constitution. And then the big one, the big win for the gay and lesbian community was the decision with the Obergefell versus Hodges case where same-sex marriage is now considered constitutional. It's protected by the 14th Amendment. A controversial policy that was designed in the 80s, known as affirmative action, has been meant to help those who have been discriminated against in either employment situations or educational situations, and it's meant to help women and people of color. But people feel like that's bad because it's reverse discrimination. So an example would be like if Mr. Hicks and I were both applying for the same job. The idea is they would give it to me if we were equally qualified to help advance women. But what people criticize it for is that, let's say Mr. Hicks was way more qualified than I was for that job, but they gave it to me just because I was a woman. It's almost like an example of reverse discrimination. So people have fought this. People have fought this in court in both education and in employment. So in the Regents of University of California versus Bake case, that school had set aside, it was almost like a quota system, like we're going to accept 100 kids to our college, but 50% have to be women, 15% have to be Black, 20% have to be Hispanic, that kind of stuff. And they said that is completely unconstitutional. It violates the 14th Amendment, but you could consider race in admissions. It just can't be a set aside. The next one, there was a case where there was a point system to get into the University of Michigan, and you had a point out of, you could earn up to 100 points, and if you got a 75 out of 100, you could get into their school. Well, it was something along the lines of 20% of the points were being a person of color. So if you weren't a person of color, you automatically were docked to 80 points. A white girl didn't get in. She sued the school and they said, yeah, you can't do that either. It can be considered almost like extra points in admissions, but it can't be like a requirement to get points in admissions. In work, they at first said in the 70s that quotas were okay and constitutional, but then they kind of reversed that in the 90s with the Aradan constructors or Arteran construction work constructors versus Pena, which basically said that you can only use affirmative action if it is narrowly tailored to meet a compelling government interest. So it pretty much said you have to like have full on proof it needs to be done or you can't do it. So affirmative action has kind of gone by the wayside. All right, so the moral of the story of these notes is that the two groups that have struggled the most for getting civil rights over American history are racial minorities and women. And the way that the government has fixed this by providing civil rights have either been with legislation, like the Civil Rights Act, or constitutional amendments, like the 13th, 15th, 19th Amendments. And civil rights have now been expanded to new groups past just racial minorities and women. All right, so that is it for me. Have a good one.